In 1778, a frail 83-year-old man sat in a carriage approaching the outskirts of Paris. He had been in exile for nearly 30 years, a ghost returning to a city that had once tried to break him. When the customs officers stopped the carriage to check for illegal contraband or smuggled goods, the old man leaned out with a sharp, mischievous glint in his eyes. He told the guards, "There's nothing contraband here, except for me." That man was Voltaire. To the French crown, he was a dangerous agitator. To the church, a heretic. But to the public waiting in the streets, he was a living legend. What's truly striking about Voltaire isn't just his defiance, but the world he walked away from to achieve it. He wasn't a starving revolutionary with nothing to lose. He was born into the top 1% of the 18th century. His father was a wealthy royal official, a man who had mastered the art of playing the game to secure a comfortable life. His father's advice to him was simple. Just follow the rules, don't stir the pot, you can have your piece of the cake. For a while, it seemed the young Voltaire might listen. He had the connections, the wit, and the family wealth to live a life of absolute luxury in the heart of Paris. But there was a fundamental contradiction in his spirit. Every time the system offered him a seat at the table, he chose to flip the table over. He was thrown into the Bastille twice. He was beaten by noblemen's lackeys and had his books publicly burned by the hangman. Yet instead of being tamed by the state's iron fist, each blow only seemed to sharpen his pen. He lived a life of strange paradoxes. A man who socialized with kings but dismantled the logic of monarchy. A traitor who was arguably the greatest patriot France ever knew. It makes you wonder, why would someone who already possessed everything, money, fame, and safety, willingly choose a life of exile and persecution? Was he a man who simply loved to fight, or did he see a coming storm that no one else dared to acknowledge? Today, we're diving into the story of the strongest rebel in history, a man who proved that the most dangerous thing you can smuggle into a country isn't a weapon, but an idea.
And that idea he smuggled back, it wasn't just a critique, it was a complete blueprint for how a healthy, functioning society should be structured.
So for this deep dive, that's what we're doing. We're looking at the architecture of modern contradiction.
Exactly. We're taking Voltaire's 18th century blueprint for what he saw as institutional health, his perfect balance of freedom and order, and we're going to stress test it. We're running it through the pressures of the 20th and 21st centuries.
Okay, so we start with the Enlightenment ideal, the perfect system on paper.
Right.
Then we look at what happens when that system starts to decay.
Right. And finally, we apply all those lessons to our current political climate. It's really about tracing the lineage of systemic failure.
I like that, the lineage of failure.
We'll start with Voltaire's liberal solutions, things like tolerance, commerce, constitutional checks. Then we'll shift gears into 20th century sociology. We'll use Émile Durkheim's concept of anomie to really understand what happens when institutions lose their moral compass.
And after that?
After that, we look at a really powerful critique of social control from Thomas Szasz, what he called the therapeutic state.
Yeah.
Which, it's a necessary check on government power when that power starts to disguise itself as healing or help.
And all of this culminates in the political mess we're in now, the constant tension between identity politics and class politics.
Which, as our sources really lay out, is the modern symptom of all these earlier structural breakdowns. Our mission here is to see how the system Voltaire admired, a system built on reason and balance, starts to fracture when you put it under overwhelming modern pressure.
Okay, let's dive in then. Section 1, Voltaire's Blueprint. The key text here, as you said, is his letters concerning the English nation. It was published in 1733.
Right, and it was written during his forced exile in London from 1726 to 1729. And you have to remember, this wasn't just a vacation, it was a full-on cultural immersion that just completely changed his worldview.
Because he was forced to see the contrast, right? Between the French absolute monarchy he came from and this really vibrant, messy English system.
And the contrast he drew wasn't theoretical, that's the key. He wasn't just admiring some abstract philosophy in a book. He was looking at the observable, practical outputs of the English economy and its political system.
He was reverse engineering the machine.
That's a great way to put it. And he believes the most important parts of that machine were the power of commerce and the rise of a meritocracy. This is why he was so obsessed with the London Royal Exchange, the financial hub of the world at the time.
He famously described it as a place more venerable than many courts of justice.
Which is such a radical thing to say, more respectable than a court of law.
So why? Why elevate a market over a court? What did he see there?
He saw the ultimate leveler. In his view, the market was the one place that enforced genuine meritocracy and, maybe more importantly, non-sectarian behavior. He just marveled at the fact that merchants from all over the world, Jew, Mohammedan, as he called Muslims, and Christian, they all did business with each other.
With complete trust in the contract.
With complete trust. He said they behaved as though they all professed the same religion.
That's fascinating. It suggests that the one true religion on the exchange was, what? Fiscal responsibility.
Exactly. It's an incredible early insight into economic liberalism. On the exchange, your professional integrity and your reliability were your identity. Your religious creed, your national origin, your family name, all the things that defined your status back in France, they meant nothing.
And Voltaire points out that they reserved the name infidel for only one type of person.
For bankrupts. That's it. If you honored your debt and you kept your word, you were a moral person. It didn't matter what church you went to or if you went to one at all.
That is profound. It's like he's saying a shared economic incentive, when it's backed by a predictable rule of law, is a much stronger glue for a diverse society than a shared moral or religious code.
And he used that observation to launch a really pointed critique at the French aristocracy he'd left behind.
He sets up this direct contrast, doesn't he, between the contributing merchant and the entrenched aristocrat.
He does. He describes the merchant, sitting in his office, dispatches orders to Surat and Grand Cairo, basically driving global trade and making the whole nation richer.
And you contrast that with his image of the aristocratic lord.
The lord who is powdered in the tip of the mode, giving himself these grand airs, but his actual function in society is reduced to acting the slave in the antechamber of a prime minister.
He's calling them parasitic. Straight up, their value is just decorative, or it's based on who they know at court.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the merchant, the commoner, is the actual engine of the nation's wealth.
And its power. This is where Voltaire connects the dots and establishes the structural link that really defines modern liberal economies. Trade makes citizens rich.
And that wealth gives them independence. It gives them leverage to demand freedom.
Exactly. And that freedom, in turn, allows commerce to expand even more, which is the ultimate source of what he called national grandeur.
He wasn't just guessing either. He pointed to England's incredible naval power in the early 18th century.
Right. He noted that this small island, with very few natural resources other than, lead and wool, could send out 3 powerful fleets at the same time in 1723. It was a show of force France couldn't match.
It's the realization that economic liberty directly fuels geopolitical strength. A free economy makes a strong nation.
But for that commerce to really flourish, you need stability. And that brings us to the second great pillar of his blueprint: religious tolerance.
And again, he wasn't just advocating for tolerance because it was the nice or moral thing to do. He argued it was structurally essential for a healthy state.
This is a point that I think gets missed a lot when we look back at the Enlightenment. It was rooted in pragmatism, not just high-minded idealism. Voltaire laid out this famous paradox about religion.
He said if there was only one religion allowed in England, the government could easily become arbitrary.
Because there would be no institutional or moral check on its power, right?
Yeah.
The state and that single faith would just reinforce each other's authority, and you'd have tyranny.
But then he says if there were 2 religions, they would just cut one another's throats.
Which, you can see that playing out today. When you have 2 deeply polarized political forces, the conflict becomes existential.
It does. The friction between 2 dominant opposing powers is often the most dangerous state. But, he says, the multitude of sects, he lists the Presbyterians, Anabaptists, Churchmen, Quakers, that complexity is what ensures they all live happy and in peace.
Because no single group can dominate.
No one can dominate. When there are too many competing interests, no one group can form a unified moral or political front against the state, or just as importantly, against each other.
And the result is they're forced to cooperate on a practical level.
Yes. The Presbyterian has to trust the Anabaptist to do business, and the Churchman relies on the Quaker's word to close a deal. The daily necessity of commerce just overrides their sectarian differences. It's a very elegant, if maybe a little cynical, defense of pluralism.
And this structural understanding of politics, it extends to his analysis of the English constitutional model. Absolutely. Voltaire sees this fundamental difference in the historical paths of England and ancient Rome. Both had bloody civil wars.
But England's civil wars led to liberty. Rome's led to slavery and collapse.
And he asks why. The answer for him boils down to the necessity of creating a robust system of checks and balances. The English system was specifically designed to create a wise government where the prince is all-powerful to do good and at the same time is restrained from committing evil.
That restraint is everything.
It is the key. The power has to be divided and set against itself. You have the king, the House of Lords, and the House of Commons. The people, through the Commons, get to share in the government without confusion.
Meaning they have real representation, a voice. And that's what prevents the kind of internal instability that requires external violence to manage.
And his comparison to Rome really drives this point home. Voltaire argued that the Roman elites considered the plebeians, the lower classes, to be a wild beast.
So how did they manage this wild beast?
They had to let loose upon their neighbors. Perpetual conquest. They had to keep the domestic population distracted, exhausted, and focused on an external enemy.
So in short, Rome's internal political failure, its inability to create a stable constitutional system that actually integrated all of its classes, that failure forced it into constant military expansion.
Exactly. Conquest was a necessity for domestic peace. But that same endless conflict is what eventually destroyed them. Voltaire's conclusion is that stable constitutional systems, like the one he admired in England, they show the absolute historical necessity of having robust incentive mechanisms and the rule of law designed for internal health, not just for external conquest.
This whole experience in England, this philosophical and political awakening, it really led to Voltaire's own intellectual revolution, didn't it?
It did. He wasn't just an admirer of these institutions. He was actively using the freedom he found there to publish his most radical work yet, La Henriade.
Which was an epic poem glorifying Henry V and basically pleading for religious tolerance.
A book that was, of course, immediately banned and publicly burned by the hangman in France. That act solidified his status as an intellectual outlaw.
He had completely reinvented himself. He wrote that he began to think and write like a free Englishman.
And this is the period where he just immerses himself in the new English philosophy and science. He's reading Locke, he's reading Newton, and this catalyzes his famous shift, championing Newtonian empiricism against the continental rationalism he grew up with.
This is what you referred to earlier as the Newton Wars. Let's unpack that a little because it's so important. Why was Newtonian empiricism so dangerous to the French establishment?
Well, the dominant philosophy in France at the time, and really across most of the continent, was Cartesian rationalism. It emphasized innate ideas, deduction, abstract reasoning.
Which often led to these elaborate philosophical speculations that conveniently tended to support traditional authority, the authority of the church and the king.
Precisely. Voltaire saw this as stifling progress. He saw French philosophy as an intellectual justification for the existing, static, and unjust social order.
So he champions Newton's empiricism as the antidote.
As the antidote. This radical idea that all knowledge must come from sensory experience, from observation, from mathematical verification. It demanded proof, not just elegant speculation. His book, Éléments de la philosophie de Newton, wasn't just an academic text.
He explicitly conceived of it as a machine de guerre war machine.
A war machine aimed directly at the Cartesian establishment. He wasn't just pitting one scientific theory against another. He was pitting a whole system of knowledge based on demonstrable fact against a system based on inherited assumptions and authority.
So he connects Bacon, Locke, and Newton into this single, superior philosophical system, one that demanded liberty, reason, and a scientific grounding for everything.
London didn't just give him his liberty back. It gave him the intellectual ammunition he needed to fight for it when he returned to France.
And that ammunition, as we know, proved to be explosive. He brought back this ideal of a self-correcting system where commerce, tolerance, and constitutional checks could ensure stability.
But the inherent tragedy of history, I suppose, is that ideals rarely survive first contact with reality.
Which sets up our transition perfectly. Voltaire gave us the blueprint for institutional stability, but the 20th century gave us a mountain of data on what happens when that stability fails. And this is where sociology has to step in to diagnose the decay.
And we turn now to Émile Durkheim and his concept of anomie. It's a term he used to describe a state of social normlessness, or really institutional decay. Voltaire's whole project of enlightened reform requires that you understand how and why institutions break down in the first place.
Because if they stop upholding the moral consensus of a society, that society spirals into this state of anomie.
Right. And Durkheim's definition of justice gives us the yardstick to measure these institutions. He defined justice very simply as granting everyone what they have the right to demand.
But why did Durkheim believe that society, the institution, had to be the one to enforce this? Why couldn't individuals just manage this among themselves?
Because the individual, left to their own devices, is governed by what Durkheim called narcissistic will. Basically, boundless, insatiable desires. Society alone, he argued, is the superior moral power. It's the only authority strong enough to set necessary, rational limits on those desires.
And if society, through its institutions, government, law, the economy, if it fails to set those limits,
the desires run wild. You get a profound sense of meaninglessness, which ultimately leads to the total collapse of the social fabric.
So anarchy isn't just chaos or disorder. It's a deep loss of moral anchoring, because the very institutions that are supposed to provide that anchor have become dysfunctional or, worse, corrupt.
Absolutely. And this moral function is what should define patriotism, according to Durkheim. He argued that true patriotism should inspire the pursuit of justice and internal improvement.
Focusing inward on things like moral development, scientific advancement, making your own society fundamentally more peaceful and just.
That's a powerful distinction he makes, isn't it? Internal improvement versus external aggression. He says that the other kind of patriotism, the aggressive, outward-focused kind, what we'd call xenophobia or competitive domination, is really just a moral release valve.
It allows individuals to justify aggressive rhetoric or actions against some perceived external enemy, whether that's another country or a scapegoat group within their own country.
And it lets them do that without violating their deeper commitments to mankind. You can hate the other without feeling like you're a fundamentally immoral person, because you tell yourself you're acting in the name of your collective. It's a total deflection from your own internal failures.
And if you look at American history, my God, you see this exact dynamic playing out during periods of immense institutional stress.
We have two really striking examples in our sources. The first is the Great Depression era, from roughly 1920 to 1940. This period combined a profound economic catastrophe with just intense institutionalized xenophobia.
This was the time of the first Red Scare, the violent racial unrest of the Red Summer, and these incredibly restrictive, fear-driven immigration policies.
The system completely failed in its economic role, and so the moral power of the country shifted toward fear and exclusion.
And what was the measurable social cost of this anomie?
It was devastating. Our sources cite these dramatic spikes in suicide rates. In 1920, the rate was around 100 per 100,000 people. During the absolute deepest point of the crisis, around 1932 and 1933, the rates just skyrocketed to over 170 per 100,000.
Wow.
It's a direct demonstration that when your economic and political institutions completely fail to impose rational limits or provide any stability, the social consequences are immediate and existential for the individual. Those rates only dropped significantly after 1943, when the war economy provided a renewed, if brutal, sense of stability and purpose.
That is a terrifyingly direct correlation between institutional health and individual mental health. Now let's jump forward to the Great Recession, spanning from roughly 2000 to the present, which also features intense political polarization and economic anomie.
The pattern just repeats itself, and in some specific groups, it's even more acute. Following the 2008 recession, some studies cited in our sources show suicide rates more than quadrupling, rising from about 12 per 100,000 to as high as 51 per 100,000 in certain demographics.
The scale of that social breakdown is just horrifying, especially when you consider the cause of the Great Recession.
And the cause, according to our sources, was classic institutional failure. It was unregulated banks and deeply unethical practices, specifically the subprime mortgage crisis. The institutions prioritized maximizing profit, that narcissistic will Durkheim warned about, over their basic social function.
And the government, which is supposed to be that superior moral power, completely failed to impose limits or enforce any kind of justice.
The lack of accountability is just staggering. I mean, think about the magnitude of that economic crime and the $5 trillion in bailouts that followed. And after all that, only one top banking executive was charged and jailed. One.
It's the ultimate example of anomie, isn't it? The rule of law became secondary to the economic function of banking. The social contract was just shattered when the public realized that a certain class of elite actors was effectively above the law, and that the whole system was fundamentally rigged in favor of financial capital.
And that failure of accountability is what creates political decay. Voltaire's ideal of a balanced, representative government is just replaced by a system that's controlled by that financial capital. Modern lobbying is the clearest expression of this.
It's funny, I often think of the Federalist Papers as the ultimate example of outside lobbying, citizens petitioning their government for the public good. Today, that whole relationship is reversed.
It's completely inverted. The government is so often controlled by corporations and the ultra-wealthy, and it transforms the entire political system into just another tool for private gain.
And the regulatory failures aren't accidental, they're intentional.
Transparency, which is the only real check on corruption, has been actively dismantled. We have a specific example in the Szasz Act. This act was originally meant to clarify the legality of trading on insider knowledge by members of Congress and other high-level officials.
But then what happened?
Key provisions, the ones that required their financial disclosures to be publicly and easily accessible online, were quietly removed by a Senate bill in 2013.
So we, the public, lost the ability to easily scrutinize potential conflicts of interest among the people who are supposed to be representing us. That's a calculated institutional retreat from accountability.
Absolutely. And then you have the rise of dark money, which is structurally designed to perpetuate this decay. Our sources detail these politically active nonprofits like Crossroads GPS and Americans for Tax Reform, alongside these mysterious shell entities, F8 LLC, Eli Publishing, WSpan LLC.
And these groups made multi-millions in undocumented donations, right? Often forming just weeks before they made a massive contribution.
Specifically to prevent any accountability, to make it impossible to trace the source of the capital. It's a sophisticated system for laundering political influence.
And this system creates clear, perverse incentives. We can see it in the documented return on investment for campaign bundlers, the people who raise huge sums of money for candidates.
The data is concrete. George W. Bush appointed roughly 200 of his bundlers to administrative posts. President Obama appointed 184 in just his first term. When raising money provides a direct, measurable return in the form of political access and appointments, your government stops being a moral institution dedicated to public justice. It just becomes an exchange platform for private financial capital.
So we have the diagnosis, institutional decay fueled by unchecked financial power. But if corruption and Anomie show how institutions fail morally, we have this other fascinating layer of critique from the 20th century, the attempt to fix social problems through medicalization.
Which is where Thomas Szasz comes in. He argued this creates a new, much subtler form of tyranny, the therapeutic state.
This is a crucial pivot, because Szasz's work is really about how power adapts. Voltaire fought the tyranny of kings and priests. Szasz fought the tyranny of doctors and counselors.
It's almost as if Szasz picked up Voltaire's own weapon logic and free speech and aimed it at a new kind of institutional power, a power that claims to be helping you. His strategic use of logic offers a lot of insight into how we can defend common sense and individual responsibility against systems that try to dissolve our identity into a pathology.
And his cornerstone assertion is deliberately provocative. Mental illness is a myth. Now, when he said this, he wasn't denying that people suffer terribly.
No, not at all. He was denying that psychiatric diagnoses are medical in nature. This is so often misunderstood as a purely scientific claim, but it's really a claim about semantics and power.
Explain that.
Szasz argued that psychiatric diagnoses are not objective descriptions of, say, a neurological lesion or a chemical imbalance. They aren't scientific facts in the same way a tumor or a broken bone is. Instead, he called them judgments of disdain that are used by authorities to justify using power over individuals.
So they're just euphemisms for what are really problems in living.
Exactly. If someone gets a psychiatric diagnosis, according to Szasz, that diagnosis is less about their objective health and more about society's discomfort with their behavior or their beliefs. He saw the whole field of psychiatry as a kind of language game, a pseudoscience that uses medical-sounding words to describe and thereby control misbehavior and unhappiness.
And he was very specific about this. He called schizophrenia the sacred symbol of psychiatry.
He did, because he argued that those individuals who are labeled with this most extreme diagnosis provide the essential justification for the whole system, for psychiatric theories, for mandatory treatments, for institutional budgets, and for legal abuses. They maintain the entire system's legitimacy.
And this idea of justifying control through diagnosis is central to his definition of the therapeutic state, a term he coined back in 1963.
Right. The therapeutic state is that collaboration between psychiatry and government. It's a system that represses, or as it would say, cures, disapproved actions, thoughts, and emotions by using these pseudo-medical interventions.
And Szasz pointed out that over time, a huge range of behaviors get redefined as illnesses requiring state intervention. Things like suicide, unconventional religious beliefs, even shoplifting, gambling, illegal drug use.
They all become symptoms. And so the state moves from regulating what you do to regulating what you think and what you feel. And that feels far more insidious than the old forms of tyranny, doesn't it?
It does, because it cloaks itself in compassion. Szasz made this great distinction between the old punitive nanny state and the new therapeutic state.
The old nanny state just told you what you couldn't do. The therapeutic state, he said, is touchy-feely, supportive, and even more authoritarian. The figure of authority shifts from the policeman to the counselor.
And the counselor, in this model, doesn't just tell you what to do. The counselor tells you what you ought to think and feel.
And Szasz's point was that the state ends up swallowing everything human on the seemingly rational grounds that nothing falls outside the purview of health and medicine.
This is where he makes his boldest historical parallels, right? He explicitly argued that this medicalization is just a continuation of historical persecution.
He drew a direct line from the persecution of witches, Jews, gypsies, and homosexuals to the modern targeting of drug addicts and the insane. The only difference is the language you use to justify the exercise of power.
He used specific examples to show how medicine expands its domain by pathologizing common human traits. You mentioned drogophobia and bariatrics. Let's elaborate on those.
Okay, take drogophobia, the fear and condemnation of non-medical drug use. Szasz argued that this is a medically manufactured social panic. Drug use, in his libertarian view, is a choice, and the persecution of users is based on a moral judgment that's just disguised as a public health imperative.
And the same logic applies to bariatrics, the branch of medicine dealing with weight control.
Exactly. The issue of being overweight is reframed as a disease that requires medical intervention. Szasz noted the rapid growth of the American Society of Bariatric Physicians in the 1970s. He argued that a non-scientific moral injunction, don't be overweight, which is a common cultural value, gets disguised as scientific, health-based advice.
It's like how former religious fasts or injunctions against gluttony were once enforced by the theological state.
Precisely. Medicine takes a moral judgment and converts it into a diagnostic category, and by doing so, it legitimizes forced interventions.
So Szasz's ultimate goal was to completely dismantle this structure of coercive power, to restore maximum individual liberty and autonomy. How did he propose we do that?
He was an absolutist on this. He believed there must be a solid, unbreachable wall between psychiatry and the state, just like the separation of church and state. He championed the abolishment of all state coercion in this realm.
He even co-founded an organization for it.
The American Association for the Abolition of Involuntary Mental Hospitalization, or AAAMH, specifically to fight against involuntary commitment.
And he also attacked psychiatry's authority in the legal system.
Yes, the insanity defense. He argued it should be abolished because it allows psychiatric testimony, which he considered religious or political, not scientific, to supersede legal judgment. Mental incompetence, he argued, should be assessed purely through legal and judicial means, without all the pseudo-medical jargon gliding the issue of personal responsibility.
And his libertarian philosophy naturally extended to drug use, which was an extremely radical stance for the time.
He saw drug use as a victimless crime and prohibition itself as the actual crime. He asserted that what we call the drug abuse problem is really just the persecution of people who use certain drugs. He even drew that sharp, shocking analogy between the language used to persecute drug users and the language the Nazis used for Jews, noting the comparison of both groups to vermin to show how dehumanizing medical rhetoric can become.
And his commitment to liberty extended to the most fundamental choice of all, the right to end one's own life,
which he saw as an ultimate expression of freedom, citing figures like Virginia Woolf. And this wasn't just an academic position for him. His commitment to autonomy was so strong that he chose to end his own life in 2012 after a painful spinal injury.
The intellectual rigor and the commitment to liberty are undeniable. But we have to look at the consequences of his influential reforms.
We do. While court decisions like O'Connor v. Donaldson upheld civil liberties by limiting the criteria for involuntary commitment, basically saying the state can't lock you up just because they think you might benefit from treatment, the resulting deinstitutionalization policies led to some devastating outcomes for the most severely mentally ill.
So the philosophical commitment to freedom didn't quite account for the societal reality. The sources note that these reforms resulted in this massive shift of the population from state asylums to the streets. It led to widespread homelessness and, tragically, massive incarceration rates.
The prisons became the new asylums. It's a well-documented phenomenon. By 2006, sources indicate that somewhere between 40 and 80% of all inmates suffered from mental illness.
So Szasz intended to provide freedom from confinement, but for the most vulnerable people, the system just traded one form of confinement, the state hospital, for a much harsher one, the street or the prison cell.
Because the institutions of the state simply failed to provide the necessary supportive community infrastructure that was needed once the coercive elements were removed.
And this failure to follow through with structural solutions after the philosophical walls were torn down, it brings us right back to the systemic injustices we talked about with Anomie, the critiques of institutional corruption and the therapeutic state. They both point toward a deep, profound injustice in the system.
Which leads us directly to the central political struggle of our time. When you're facing deep-seated injustice, how do you mobilize? Do you prioritize class and economic solutions, or do you prioritize identity and intersectional issues?
Let's start with the argument for abandoning identity politics, or IP, and focusing exclusively on class. What's the core rationale for that position?
It's largely a pragmatic argument. It's based on unity and efficacy. The proponents argue that if you focus on broad, unifying class issues, like the economic divide between the 99% and the 1%, you can create a powerful, necessary coalition that cuts across all demographics.
In their view, identity politics, which focuses more narrowly on race, gender, or sexuality, is seen as inherently divisive.
Divisive and often a manipulative tool used by elites to distract the working class from their common economic enemy.
Their core assertion is that economic problems are the root cause. So if you see inequality that falls along racial lines, that's a racial component, but it's not the fundamental racial cause.
Exactly. Their claim is that a problem like, say, for-profit prisons doesn't primarily target Black individuals because of race. It targets poor people because that's where the profit is. The root issue is the exploitation inherent in the profit motive itself.
So if you eliminate that profit motive, they argue many of the racial and gender inequality that are related to wealth will just sort of naturally correct themselves over time.
And that assumption that racism is just an artifact of economic exploitation that will magically dissipate when the economy is made equitable, that is the crucial point of disagreement.
So what's the counterargument?
The counterargument, which is rooted in intersectionality, strongly rejects the idea that you can neatly separate race and class. They argue that if you only address the class side of the equation, the so-called economic engine, you will not get holistic recovery.
Why not?
Because racial inequality is not passive. It is actively, historically, and institutionally perpetuated.
We have to bring in that historical context to really understand this claim. The sources detail how Black uncompensated labor built what they call obscene wealth for the South. And when slavery ended, there was no structural correction for that.
None. And the legacy of that historical exploitation was immediately compounded by exclusion from the wealth-building mechanisms that followed. No reparations. And crucial pieces of legislation like the Homestead Act, which distributed over 270 million acres of Western land, systematically excluded Black Americans for decades.
Even the early versions of the Social Security Act denied benefits to field and house laborers,
which were precisely the jobs held by the majority of Black Americans at the time. The NAACP explicitly called those provisions a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through, cautiously. It was intentional, systemic exclusion from the primary mechanisms of wealth creation.
And this exclusion was felt most profoundly through housing, which has been the greatest generator of generational...
The Federal Housing Administration, the FHA. From the 1930s all the way to 1968, the FHA pioneered and standardized the practice of redlining,
which was literally drawing red lines on maps, tying property values directly to racial diversity. It drove prices down in mixed race areas and designated Black neighborhoods as too risky for government-backed mortgages.
This one action actively cut Black families out of the legitimate American housing market and the safety of government guarantees. And because they couldn't get traditional mortgages, they were incredibly vulnerable to exploitation.
Which is how they ended up in contract homes.
Yes. White real estate owners would sell homes to Black families on contract, an inherently exploitive system where the buyer paid inflated prices but acquired zero equity or legal protection until the very last payment was made. The contract could be broken at any point for any minor infraction.
And the numbers are just staggering. The sources note that by 1962, 85% of Black homeowners in Chicago lived in these exploitative contract homes. It generated massive untaxed wealth for the sellers while trapping families in a cycle of perpetual debt.
And this institutional history created permanent nexuses of concentrated poverty. Our sources highlight the statistical outcome of this. Only 4% of white adults grew up in neighborhoods where 40% or more of the residents lived below the poverty line.
And for Black adults?
For Black adults, that number is a staggering 62%. The historical failure to address identity-based economic exclusion is still clearly visible in the data today.
And this leads to the second major point against the class-only approach. Racial inequality isn't just a historical artifact. It's actively perpetuated today, especially through the justice system.
Right. If the problem were just the profit motive in prisons, then getting rid of it would be enough. But opponents argue that laws are specifically designed to target poor Black people. The most infamous example is the differential mandatory minimum sentencing for crack cocaine versus powder cocaine.
Crack was primarily associated with Black users, powder with white users. And the sentencing for crack was disproportionately, astronomically harsh.
And beyond the laws themselves, the application of the law demonstrates deep racial bias. We have the example of stop and frisk policies. These policies were eventually struck down by federal courts because they were found to be explicitly and overwhelmingly racist in how they were carried out.
An investigation into police stops in New York found that the #1 predictor for a police stop was not the crime rate or the poverty rate of a neighborhood.
It was the racial composition. Black men under 30 in predominantly Black areas were being stopped constantly, even in middle-class, safe neighborhoods. This proves that racial inequality is actively enforced, independent of a pure economic need for profit.
And the bias continues right through sentencing. Even when you control for prior record, for age, for wealth, Black people still receive demonstrably harsher sentences than white people for the exact same crime.
Which suggests that simply fixing the economic system will not automatically dismantle the deeply ingrained racism within our legal and enforcement structures.
So this leads to the definitional battle. Is class itself an identity? The people who want to abandon IP tend to define identity narrowly as fixed traits, race, gender, sexuality. They see class as more fluid.
But the counter-argument is that class is also an identity, especially in modern political movements that have successfully appealed to the sense of identity held by the ignored blue-collar worker or the forgotten rural American. That's an identity appeal.
And if you look across the political aisle, our sources are clear. The right wing is often much more blatant and, frankly, more effective in its use of identity politics.
Oh, constantly. They use xenophobia, dog whistle racism, and an us versus them framing all the time.
And they succeed because they are appealing to majority identities, the identity of being a white Christian American, for example. The argument is that when commentators suggest liberals should abandon identity politics, what they're implicitly suggesting is that liberals should yield the entire field to majority or white male identity politics.
Which is seen as a cynical attempt to silence minority grievances under the convenient guise of unity. So the common synthesis that many of our sources arrive at is a why not both approach.
A pragmatic blend.
Yeah.
One that recognizes that class is the single most critical economic issue affecting everyone, regardless of race or gender. But
that identity issues cannot be ignored because they are structurally fused with and actively exacerbate that income divide.
Ignoring minority grievances doesn't create unity.
Right.
It just alienates the necessary coalitions you need to fight the 1% and the institutional decay we've been talking about this whole time.
As one of our sources put it, quoting from the show The Wire, all the pieces matter. You have to blend both class and identity representation to achieve any kind of holistic progress.
What a sweeping analysis. We began with Voltaire's 18th century blueprint for institutional health, one that was rooted in commerce, constitutional balance, and rational tolerance. His ideal was this elegant, self-correcting system designed to maximize both liberty and stability.
And we traced the decay of that ideal through the 20th century. We saw Durkheim's concept of anomie, which illustrated how institutional failure evidenced by regulatory corruption and those devastating spikes in suicide erodes the moral fabric of a nation, turning the government into just a tool of private narcissistic will.
We then explored Thomas Szasz's powerful critique of the therapeutic state, showing how the attempt to enforce social order by medicalizing deviance creates a very modern form of institutional tyranny, shifting control from the pulpit or the throne to the counselor's office and the diagnostic manual.
And finally, we saw how all these systemic decays, The historical injustice and the modern failure of accountability have structurally fused class and identity, making them inseparable issues in our contemporary political struggle. Voltaire provided the architectural drawings for a healthy society, and our 21st century sources detailed the immense complexity of trying to fix the resulting chronic illness, where all the pieces are completely interwoven.
It brings us back to that inherent friction, doesn't it? The friction between the pursuit of a philosophically perfect solution and the achievement of functional, real-world results. The search for the absolute best system so often stalls or even prevents any actual progress.
That realization is so critical for anyone who wants to engage with reform. Voltaire, the greatest champion of reason and enlightened action, he understood this paradox perfectly. He wrote, "Truth is a fruit that can only be picked when it is very ripe." But also, and perhaps most relevantly to our modern political moment, the best is the enemy of the good.